The last time was just here, thanks. And then I'll ask you second. Because, this person here was first. Sorry, and then you second.
Thank you very much, both of you, for this very interesting and clarifying lectures. So, my question was actually to Dr. Hyun about the transition between the non-proven approach versus the evidence-based clinical trial approach. So I do agree with the principle, also because many of the clinical trials are the result of anecdotal cases that have been studied, and although no convincing evidence is presented by the case, it has initiated something that leads to an established clinical trial. But in some way, the two are in competition. So if you use the first approach in order to arrive at a clinical trial to provide solid evidence, then I would say that's perfect. But in a way, they are in competition. So if there is no monitoring of the data, there's no collection of the data, and good analysis of the outcome, then it competes with the clinical trial, and it prevents the clinical trial. So how do you see the balance between the two?
So you're right. They do. I mean, what the ICSR guidelines try to do is try to hit that, what you call sort of the perfect complement to one another, right? So after some experience with a few patients, you gather data, you try to construct the beginnings of an exploratory or pilot study, right? But you're right to point out there could be this competition. There is not gathering of information. I am on the IRB right now for my institution, and we reviewed for a colleague recently where the investigator basically said, well, everybody does it this way. We just want to finally gather the data and publish. And so there definitely does seem to be that sort of element of medicine that people try something new, it kind of becomes widespread, but it wasn't actually based on a trial. And then you just try to then retrospectively do a clinical trial so that you can get reimbursement from insurance companies or whatever for that technique. So what the ICSR guidelines try to do is they do try to go from one to the other, right? So the cases that we were imagining for cell-based therapies would be things like, in the early stages, you do want to have some experience with patients because you want to find out things like, what's the right cell dosage, what's the right patient population, what's the right indication for this. Because you need some additional information to design your clinical trial in the beginning. You need something. So that's why many people in the task force advocated for some responsible medical innovation, but they were thinking, in order to then construct a reasonable clinical trial or scientifically rigorous one. So they've already kind of been thinking along those lines. So we didn't, I believe, have anybody on the committee that sort of advocated for the competing approach, which would just be, just do it and don't gather information. It's not research. I didn't have anybody who said that. Everybody that I believe I interacted with, and then that went for external comment, try to, as much as possible, put those two practices together, so one goes into the other. The challenge there, of course, that people just may not. I mean, if you're a clinician, you may not really have any interest, or your site's set on research. You have to maybe hand that off to somebody else to take that on. We didn't speak to that issue at all.
Thank you.
Can we keep using this word unproven, proven, experimental? The problem is that I was in a meeting with Indian Council of Medical Research. People asked a simple question: when does something become proven? And the thing is, there was no answer to that. And I just was wondering if you can give me an answer. When do we say an unproven therapy is a proven therapy? What's the point?
Yeah, I wish I could give you the definition of when you know. And even things that are so-called proven, when they go like phase 4 or when they enter the marketplace, you realize maybe it wasn't as efficacious as you thought, or there were adverse events that you to say that statistically something won't happen, you need an enormous sample size, and it probably won't be until it goes to market that you find out these things that then counterbalance the good effects, and you think it's not proven or it's not recommended anymore. So yeah, when do you know? That's a really, that's actually a really interesting challenge for stem cell-based therapies in the clinical trial system. There are not going to be large numbers of patients involved. It's very expensive. You have to scale up your product to, to cover thousands of subjects. It's probably you're never going to have thousands of subjects, which makes the Japanese situation very interesting because what people are afraid of is that it will really undermine in Japan the ability, and maybe even around the world, ability for people to recruit enough subjects for their stem cell-based studies. Now, people thought, well, it's just something kind of like the orphan diseases approach in the U.S. because some people said, well, for orphan diseases or for very rare diseases, it may be reasonable in those circumstances to allow clinicians to use unproven therapies, and then keep data, keep track along the way. The problem with that analogy, though, is with stem cell-based therapies, the numbers of potential patients that would be interested in that are so much larger than the rare disease cases, right? So if I were a patient, why would I enter a clinical trial? If I really, this is the therapeutic misconception, if I don't have therapeutic misconception, I'd say, well, why would I enter a clinical trial for my own self-interest? If I don't know, nobody knows, let's say, which group I'm going to be in, and nobody knows whether this is going to work, and maybe even the cell dosage is not clinically relevant, they just want to do safety study, whatever. Why would I do that if I could just go ahead and just get the therapy from the doctor? And maybe along the line I can contribute to growth of knowledge because they're going to keep track of efficacy along the way. I think that's a major challenge for recruitment.
But see, so that's the point I want to make, because all through multiple presentations today and yesterday, an underlying theme has been centers and doctors in China and India offer unproven therapies, and so what they're doing is 1, 2, 3, 4 incorrect. Now, we do not have a definition of what is proven. Now, when we don't have a definition of what's proven, how do we say that something is unproven? I mean, it's very big. Either you have a clear definition, this is proven. Now, we don't have that definition. And for example, let's say, Wise Young with the SAI China network, there's a great trial going on, okay, multicentric. But what that trial will show is that umbilical cord derived mononuclear cells implanted into the spinal cord in a particular technique works or does not work, right? It will not say, for example, whether embryonic stem cells work. It will not say, for example, whether adult stem cells work. So that's the distinction between cell therapy and drugs. In drugs, it's clear-cut. There is a molecule, either cures the infection, it controls the disease, or it does not. I mean, there is no two ways about this. In cell therapy, there's so many permutations. So the whole point here is that there is criticism of what's happening in Asia, the fundamental criticism that we're doing unproven therapies, when on the other hand we don't know when something will become proven. So I just want your opinion on that from an ethical point of view.
So I'll ask both,
Yeah.
both to respond, and then we'll move on to the next question.
I'd just like to react to the idea that yesterday and today we've been talking about proven and unproven. I think we've been arguing against that distinction, in fact. And if you look at the Japanese government, they actually find your question a very good one. And in order to make it possible to give companies permission after the first phase to have a business license and to provide new unproven products to the patients, they have said, well, in order to facilitate that, we need to have extra long periods of post-marketing research and follow-up. And follow-up, most post-marketing research, is going to be extremely intensive. And when I spoke with people from industry in Japan, there was an enormous nervousness about what that will mean, because that is going to be perhaps as expensive as going through clinical trial 1 to 3 can be. And so I think that everyone here is quite aware of what proven means. And another discussion that is also taking place at Weekend in Kobe is that, well, do we need 10 patients even to get through a so-called clinical trial now? Because I spoke with a director there of clinical trials and translational medicine, and he said, well, it's all right for us to just have 3 or 5 patients. So I think it would be very uncareful to say that there is one kind of view about what proven means in this matter. And also the patients themselves, they have also these same doubts. And as we were talking just then, we treat patients as people that think, well, what is good for me? Or and I don't think that's always the case either. Patients all the time think, what's good for my family? What's good for society? And so for that reason, you find that in the clinical trial for macular regeneration in Japan, the first clinical trial here, I spoke with Takahashi Mashio, and probably many of you will know that, but when she advertised for people to just have a security study done, which does involve an operation, she had hundreds of people coming directly to her lab saying, well, I want to participate. And they knew that nothing in the situation would be improved. So I think we should have a far more nuanced view about what proven is here.
Yeah, and I think one could argue that the crucial issue isn't necessarily how do we define proven versus unproven, but maybe sort of what are we really interested in being confident about before offering this as a commercially available therapy. One might be, so do we understand the mechanism of action? And what's interesting about that point is there are people in disagreement about whether or not we really do need to understand fully the mechanism of action or not. I mean, we still don't know how deep brain stimulation works. It seems to work. Okay, so do we really need to? So that's one so proven, unproven. That's sort of maybe not the big issue. The big issue is should we understand mechanism of action? That then you can explain or understand how the therapy works. So that's one. The other one might be, do we understand how this therapy compares against a comparator or competitor in terms of benefit to the patient? So without a clinical trial, you wouldn't know how well it compares against standard of care or placebo or something like that. Another issue might be, do we know enough about the therapy to know what the risk-benefit profile is to then offer good informed consent for the patient? Do we really know, what the potential harms, potential benefits are in relation to one another? And that may have to be determined through a clinical study. So those might be sort of the key kinds of questions that you're really interested in when you're asking the question, is it proven or unproven? Maybe that just reduces to these other issues that are a little bit more manageable, and then you realize, well, no, we do need to do a study to answer those kinds of questions about the therapy in question. And if somebody says, not that they can't do that, but they're unwilling to do that, then that's interesting ethical response.
I have noted down about 2 dozens of questions or comments. I will restrict myself to a couple. I will start with the smallest one. Margaret has extensively used the expression patient needs and patient demands. It occurs to me that when one tries and define what is a patient demand in medicine, one finds oneself treading on shifting grounds, because there is no patient who ever demanded to be treated with stem cell for ALS before somebody else told that person that there are stem cells and that they could be used to treat ALS. So I think that this is a serious risk for misrepresentation of things, because we are dealing with the opening of a market, and this market is clearly oriented by the sellers who tell the public this is what you need, not unlike any other market, particularly not unlike any high-tech market. None of us knew that we would need an iPhone before somebody told us that there was an iPhone. So the patient demands is a very risky thing in medicine. This brings to my mind the exercise that somebody did in Italy last year. They tried to plot Google Trends versus number of PubMed entries in terms of stem cell treatments. And the only way in which they could document a highly significant correlation between Google Trends and PubMed papers on stem cell therapies was to use the trick of listing the Google Trend for year X and the PubMed publications for year X+1, providing evidence, if you allow, that
a lot of even the scientific output is actually being driven by what we refer to as patient demands, which itself is being driven by something else. This leads to a very key point. The key point is, just like we have trouble in defining where the demand of the patient arises, the real problem is, where does the knowledge go in all this scheme? All that we've been discussing without telling each other is that we're discussing something which we believed was part of something we call medicine. There is no therapy, as far as I know, outside of medicine. And medicine is a body of knowledge. So what we're discussing is a change in the scheme in which therapy is part, and only a part, of an exchange of knowledge between a patient and someone we call a doctor, and a different kind of human interaction, of social interaction, which boils down to a mere market transaction, which is between the demand of a consumer and the provider of a therapy. So what is missing here is the knowledge. And if you wipe out the knowledge, then questions like the one we just heard arise. How do we know that a therapy is proven or unproven? Well, I think that this philosophical overtone, which is something that resonates in statements like cells are not drugs, I would argue that cells are drugs, and there are many arguments in that respect. But
Question?
if we restrict ourselves to this point, it's not proven versus unproven, it's approved for market versus non-approved for market. Okay? This is the key point, because Western medicine has evolved out of the birth of regulation of the market. And the content of regulation of the market, the specific content of regulation of the market is, yes, you can put snake oil on the market. Show me, A, that it is snake oil, and B, that it works for arthritis as you claim. So this is the point, and this is the single point that is being disrupted. There is no need to prove that the snake oil is snake oil. We use stem cells. Who knows that those cells are stem cells? And second, we use stem cells that work in arthritis, and nobody knows that they work in arthritis. Let me remind you, there are about 400 clinical trials with intravenous MSCs for an endless list of disorders, which range from autism to urinary infection. We don't know, because of the mere existence of those trials, that the cells work. And actually, none of those trials was published, very few of them were, and none of those trials list any results on the web repository that enlist them.
Thanks for the point. I don't think there was a question there either, but I'm going to pass to Paula.
Would like to hear.
Okay, some quick responses, please, then.
I think your remarks about demand, patient demand and patient needs is core to actually what we're doing. Whatever a patient need is, we usually do not really know when we discuss with a patient at a clinic in, for instance, Baker Biotech. The patient has already established what their need is. So for them, it's clear that they want therapy for whatever reason. They know it through the internet, they know it from elsewhere. And what you're saying is they're just buying a product here. It's a question not of patient need or patient demand. It's a question of the market. This is one of the reasons why we have been organizing 4 workshops in 4 different countries, in Korea, in Japan, in China and India. And we've been discussing with people with special cord injury, muscular dystrophy, diabetes and heart diseases, what they think they need in these different contexts. And so we've been doing quite detailed research here, and we find that the needs of the patients in these different countries are sometimes entirely different. So the spinal cord injury patient in India does want to have a quick scientific solution, but another actually more urgent need for them was good wheelchairs, more dignity in daily life, having a job. And so doing this kind of research puts actually the regenerative medicine very much into perspective. And we far more need to include the public rather than just the market in discussions such as these about what is ethical selling, because we seem to think that the market is just some kind of mechanism that leads its own life, but it is something that consumers are steering and have influence on, and that's why we need to have this discussion more than ever. But thank you for your question.
Thanks. Insoo, did you want to say anything to that one? Okay, so we'll go to the next question.
It's very difficult to restrain oneself to one question.
I'm afraid we have time for one more.
Yeah. So, Margaret, you were mentioning that in the last slide you said that non-scientific elements dominate scientific exchange. Let's assume that you not only refer to China, but to the global industry of science. This allows two different kinds of interpretations, which are not exclusive. One is non-science factors could be things like, well, what's the commonwealth, what's the social interests, what's, well, well-being. These are far beyond science, so this could be non-science interest. The other is obviously the narrow interest of some industry or commercial or economic players or individual careers and so on. I assume that you, in the critical line of that, you refer to the latter part as having to say, maybe adding politics to that as well. This brings me to a very fundamental observation. How can we expect health-related scientific industry to operate according to its purpose when we program science as an industry according to non-scientific principles? That is, according to defined, very practically and positively defined economic incentives for scientists, publish or perish as one of the drivers here. We take away responsibility from individual scientists and allow it to be taken over by an anonymizing system of governance, which doesn't deserve this name. We don't co-opt scientists as responsible citizens for what they're doing. We are making them small factors to produce whatever scientists are to produce. How does that relate to science as such, and to health, to medicine? I think we need a bigger vision of a kind of critical approach to really make use of your wonderful analysis of the empirical situation here. First of all, we need a clear idea what science is and should be about. And this I think, will explain a lot. If we have a Wissenschaft, the German concept of science, which is inclusive and open, or if we have a, inclusive, market-driven kind of science, that will have its own logic, as we can see it now. It's a very kind of Reaganomics or post-Reaganomics approach to science. I think this will, downstream, this kind of approach will help us to see which of these questions we're discussing are just, secondary because they're part of the problem, and which problems we really have, but we have a decent system of science, because we do have problems there as well. So some are secondary and others are primary issues. What do you think about this approach?
Great. Okay, we're going to end on that question, and we're going to turn to each of the panelists to respond.
Thank you for a very important question. It's an enormous question which is impossible to reply to in just 1 minute. There's many books written about this topic. I would recommend Stephen Shaping's Never Pure, which is all about how science is a collective enterprise. If you have knowledge, you need to be able to communicate it with in your society before it's been taken seriously and before you can sell it. And I think we also should get away from the traditional idea of what science is, not a scientist alone in a room, but scientists need to eat, they need to breathe, they have ethics, they are just like you and me, social creatures, and also need incentives or want to give space to their creativity. And so we need to redefine really what we want the scientific institutions to be. If we want to regulate them in detail and have governments tell them exactly what to do, then we probably make it impossible for scientists to work as these kind of normal human beings. So I think that needs to be rethought, but apart from that, I don't think we should program science. And when I mentioned scientific and non-scientific distinctions, I don't mean that there is a line between science and non-science, exactly the opposite, that it is society that produces science, and how it wants to shape it is limited. We have to think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that in the U.S. anyway, the problem is getting worse. When economic times get tougher, the pressures get greater for science to be more applied, more economically driven, return economic wars. So, for example, universities now are extremely, they apply a lot of pressure on their faculty to pursue lines of research that, that are, externally funded, and who's funding it. I mean, the funders have a real emphasis on applicability, clinical translation of medical research that, less and less about just basic discovery, basic mechanism of action, things like that. I know in the state of Ohio that there's state money available, but that's come for scientific research, but that's come from tobacco lawsuit settlements. They're earmarked for improving health and sort of immediate impact on economic return and social well-being. And these drivers, the university pressure, funding pressure, places enormous pressure on the scientists what they should spend their time doing, what they're going to get recognized for. So that's also a major part of the problem. It's a self-feeding problem.
Right?
No, yeah. Well, yeah. So it's a little hard to sort of break out of that. I say, well, I have another ideal of what science should be, and what it should be about. Well, good luck surviving at the university. I think it's yeah. So I think that's also part of the issue too.
Great. Well, I'd like you to join me in thanking both of the panelists for a really good. Many of these issues we'll continue to discuss later into the afternoon. We've got 1 hour's break now for lunch.